At the most minimalist conceptual level, God would be the eternal entity that would have created the cosmos. The notion of entity underlines the general characteristic of something that is endowed with conscience, intelligence, and will, regardless of the degree of this consciousness, this intelligence, and this will, and no matter what is other characteristics of this thing. If one thing is devoid of conscience, intelligence, and will, then this thing is not an entity. It is simply something that one could possibly qualify in different ways, but it is not an entity. A pebble is one thing, while a ladybug is an entity. A cloud is one thing, while sardine is an entity. A mountain is one thing, while a chimpanzee is an entity. And if we postpone this notion to subtle things, it seems, for example, that a current of telluric energy is one thing, while an invisible creature haunting an abandoned house is an entity.No matter what it is about its other characteristics. An entity is something that has the particularity of being endowed with consciousness, intelligence, and will.It can be small like a mosquito or immense as a whale. It is always an entity. A human being is an entity. In case you have not made the deduction of it yourself, spiritual thinking admits the existence of subtle dimensions within reality, and therefore within the cosmos. This does not mean that these dimensions are less substantial than the physical dimension. This simply means that these dimensions are characterized by intrinsic vibrations greater than the intrinsic vibration which determines the physical dimension. There are physical entities, and there are subtle entities. Just as certain physical entities can be equipped with great capacities due to their constitution or due to the exercise of their intelligence and their will, as we can see many examples among humans or among animals, in the same way certain subtle entities can also be equipped with powerful capacities due to their constitution or acquired by the exercise of their intelligence and their will.At, the most minimalist conceptual level. Once again, God would be the eternal entity that would have created the cosmos.As much as the existence of entities is a fact, as much the existence of an original entity of the cosmos. To specify it in these terms is a hypothesis and not a fact. An entity is fundamentally one thing. It is therefore fundamentally made up of substance. More specifically, an entity is fundamentally made up of some modality of organization of the primary substance, and everything is made up of some modality of organization of the primary substance. The real difference between a rock and a human is the level and type of complexity of the organization of the primary substance, which constitutes the rock and the human. This means that the reason why the rock is devoid of the special qualities that are consciousness, intelligence, and will is that the organization of the substance within it is not of sufficient level and of the adequate type. And the reason why humans have these special qualities is that the level and type of complexity of the substance within it are in adequate values. An entity is something whose level and type of complexity are high enough to bring out the special qualities of consciousness, intelligence, and will. Destroying this complexity and this organization is killing the entity as an entity, without necessarily annihilating the primary substance that constituted it. When an elephant dies, what dies is the elephant entity. It was not the substance that was organized as an elephant. An entity cannot be non-substantial. One thing that exists cannot be non-substantial.To exist, is to have substance. It does not matter that this substance is physical or that it is subtle. A magnetic field exists in the same way as a rock, although the substance modality in the magnetic field seems less palpable and less dense than what is in the rock. You knock in a rock if you try to walk through it, but you are going through a magnetic field without even realizing that there is something there. You see the rock and touch it with your hands, but you do not see the magnetic field, and you do not grasp anything from it by extending your hands. The magnetic field is no less real than the rock. It is real differently. But the general principle is the same. The magnetic field and the rock are both substantial, and made up of substance at some level and in some type of complexity. Real. Things and real entities are substantial and say that something or an entity exists, that is to say that it is substantial. If God exists, and remember the general minimum definition of God, if God exists, it is necessarily an entity consisting of some level and some type of complexity in the organization within it of the substance. One of the logical implications of this is that God cannot have created the primary substance that constitutes it, and he cannot have presided over the process of the organization and the complexification of this primary substance. If God exists, it is not the primary substance, it is of the primary substance organized and complexified, and it cannot be at the origin of this process of organization and complexification in its own breath. If we say that God is eternal, then what we say is that the substance organized within it with the adequate level and type of complexity has always been organized, always. Is it possible? If this is possible, then there is not reason that there is only one God, but on the contrary, there must certainly be several other gods in this case, all as eternal as each other. So that it would have no sense to speak of God. It would necessarily be necessary to speak of the gods without any of these gods having created the others, without any of these gods being older than the others, without any of these gods having some form of fundamental precedence, whether with regard to other gods. And if that is impossible, then there cannot be God. Not the least. What is the question actually? It's this one. Is it possible that there is an eternal entity? To say that there is an eternal entity, what would that mean exactly? The status of the primary substance must be understood. Nothing can arise from nothing. Nothingness is not an ordinary notion of emptiness. It is the radical notion of vacuum.In, the ordinary concept of vacuum. An already existing space is presupposed, but which would contain nothing. But if there is a space, within the emptiness of this space, there is already space, that is to say, the capacity to welcome something, that is to say, a kind of immanent tension which is ready to support the existence of everything that would come to be put there. If this immanent tension did not exist, nothing could exist anywhere in space. Things would disappear as soon as they would be put in some point of space. The notion of radical vacuum supposes the very absence of space, and this absence is impossible. But assuming that there is still a nothingness, of this nothingness cannot arise, because nothingness is the very idea of the absence of anything in nothingness, including therefore absence anything that is likely to contribute to the coming to the existence of anything. If there is space, there can be no nothingness, and there can be no other in no way of space. If there is nothingness, then there should only be nothingness and nothing alone. And if that had been the case, nothing would exist, no space, no time, or primary substance. The mere fact that you read these lines is the empirical proof that there is not, and that there has never been any nothingness. If you understand what this implies, then you understand that this implies that the primary substance has always existed. She is eternal. This does not mean that the organizational methods that parts of the primary substance can adopt are eternal. This does not mean that things and entities are eternal. Itis, just the primary substance in itself, that is, eternal. The empty space is not really empty, it is lined with primary substance, and this primary substance is animated by internal dynamics, which, from time to time, plots of primary substance will organize and become things or entities. If there is an eternal entity, it is impossible that this entity has created the primary substance. The most plausible configuration would rather be that there is no eternal entity, but that the primary substance has always been animated by these dynamisms which have always led plots of the primary substance to organize in things or entities. So that there is neither an eternal entity nor the first entity of among all. A strictly logical level, Nothing prohibits the fact that there can be an eternal entity, that is to say, nothing prohibits the fact that a plot of the substance has been organized in an entity forever. But always at the strictly logical level, if such an entity exists, it remains impossible that it has created the substance. Simply she would always coexist with the rest of the substance, itself being an organized plot of the substance.Asa. The idea of God implicitly supposes that it is God who would have created the raw material of the cosmos, and which would have created the cosmos in itself. God cannot exist, or there can be an eternal entity. And still at the strictly logical level, nothing prohibits that there can be several eternal entities, and nothing limits one the possible number of eternal entities which would always coexist with the general primary substance.At, the strictly logical level. This is what it is. The primary substance is necessarily eternal. No entity has created it. It has always existed. And the general observation of the cosmos allows us to deduce that the primary substance is necessarily animated by internal dynamics, and it is the dynamics which make possible the formation of things and entities. If you understand the implications of all this, then you understand that the most likely scheme has always been that things and entities have emerged within the primary substance, due to the intrinsic internal dynamic activity of the primary substance.No entity is at the origin of this dynamic activity. This activity is an intrinsic characteristic of the primary substance. But it is quite possible that certain entities develop enough power to become able to take plots of substance and model them in organized and complex systems. This is what humans do when they develop machines, and that is what humans will do when they are able to synthesize laboratory DNA and create animal entities from the synthesis of their DNA. If there was an eternal entity, it would not be God. It would be at most a demiurge, and there would be no reason for it to be only one eternal entity. God does not exist. It is simply impossible that it exists. What can exist are demiurges, that is to say, eternal entities capable of adding their action to the processes of transformations which are already natural within the primary substance and which already give birth to things and to entities. The most likely hypothesis is that there is no eternal entity, but that the primary substance has always had such an internal natural dynamic activity that it brings out complex things and entities from time to time, and entities strew within it. Has always been. And some of these entities can become powerful enough to acquire enough knowledge and enough capacities in order to allow them to prolong the dynamic of the primary substance, and therefore to develop more complex and more varied things, and even variously complex entities and variously configured. None of these powerful entities would be God, and none of these powerful entities would be a demiurge.It, would simply be powerful entities capable of creating, that is to say, capable of taking plots of the primary substance and modeling them according to sophisticated and functional organizations, until creating new living entities. Within humanity, is a class of human beings who take care of developing the genetic sciences, and others who take care of developing the technology of transport and travel machines. So, there are geneticists and engineers. It is quite possible that geneticists become capable in the future to create living creatures in the laboratory, including creatures which would possibly be as intelligent as human beings in general, without necessarily having the expert knowledge of geneticians. And it is quite possible that engineers become capable in the future to transport and install geneticists and other scientists on another planet. It is not an effort of unbridled imagination that is necessary here, but only a little intellectual courage, because the embryos of these possibilities are already visible within humanity when we are in the first quarter of the 21st century. Fortunately, not all humans are occupied by the subjects of money, sex, and entertainment. There are entire classes that focus on mastering and developing scientific knowledge and technological systems. There should also be whole classes that seriously focus on mastery and development of psychic capacities, but this is another subject. Nothing prohibits that in the future, men of knowledge from the earth come to create intelligent creatures on another planet. They will have become creators of life forms, and some of these life forms will be intelligent creatures, capable of developing beliefs on God, among others. Yes, entities can reach levels of development that allow them to become creators of life forms. We will simply say creators, but we will obviously imply the technical capacity to create life forms from the mastery of the synthesis of DNA. Geneticists in humanity can reach the level of knowledge and technologies necessary to become creators. Engineers within humanity can reach the level of knowledge and technologies necessary to become masters of space travel. The association of these two classes of men of knowledge can lead to what we are considering here, namely a colony of men of knowledge that will create life on another planet. And with regard to the fundamental elements of mythological texts and sacred texts, when we are interested in the texts in themselves without being influenced by the traditions of religious exegesis, the text suggests that powerful entities from heaven are one day arrived on planet Earth and have undertaken to create life on Earth. That some of these creators have tried to make people believe that they were God. It should no longer impress us today, now that we have enough clarity to reflect to understand that none of the creators of earthly life is God. It doesn't matter that he had it written in this or that book selected as sacred.